Hello, here's a contribution to the FairShare virtual garden tour. It's coming to you from Steve Ventura, Professor Emeritus at UW. You can pick which Steve you think is bringing you the message here today. I also want to acknowledge my friends and colleagues that have contributed to this. Kristen McAdow and Doug Soldat at UW Department of Soil Science, all of the contributors to the Growing Healthy Soils for Healthy Communities project in Milwaukee, and of course, ruthless grabbing of internet images. If any small silver lining has emerged out of our COVID-19 crisis, it is that people are becoming more aware of our food system and its vulnerability. Food doesn't just come from a supermarket. Food is grown by people. And with time on our hands, people are realizing they can grow their own food, that in fact it does come from plants in the ground, just as the major disruption to society of the world wars created interest and impetus for victory gardens. COVID-19 has renewed interest in groceries and vegetable gardens in backyards. This might be any kind of backyard, even abandoned lots in inner cities. This is in Milwaukee in the Walnut Way neighborhood, where backyards and side lots, abandoned properties have been turned into productive gardens. They've helped revitalize neighborhoods and have helped clean up some of the blight of abandoned properties. Of course, gardening is not without its hazards and challenges. It does take some skill to understand how to do it and what not to do, and how to avoid some of the problems that commonly come up in trying to grow food. The hazard that I would like to focus on for just a few minutes is lead. Lead is a naturally occurring element, but it is often in much higher amounts in soils, particularly in older parts of cities. And as I think most people know, lead is a poison. It is particularly pernicious in children. As noted in this quote, there is no safe amount of blood lead. Particularly in children, it can lead to nervous system disruptions. It can lead to poor educational outcomes. It can lead to juvenile delinquency and can be an impairment for a lifetime. Lead in the environment is a social and racial justice issue. Everyone has heard about the challenges of the water supply in Flint, Michigan, but that is one example of many, many different ways and places where particularly lower income and people of color are exposed to lead. It is also, as noted in this talk, in the soil. It is in the peeling paint on old buildings and other sources as well. In older parts of cities, any portion of a city built prior to the mid-1970s, we have a legacy of lead, from tetraethyl lead used as a gasoline additive and lead used in paint. that lead does not go away. It remains in the environment. It remains, in particular, in this case, in the soil. Lead contamination is not exclusively a city issue. We also have legacy lead in former agricultural lands that may now be subdivisions. We see lead problems near shooting ranges, and through much of southwest Wisconsin there is legacy contamination from lead mining. Cities are built on top of former lead mines, unfortunately. The good news is that we are no longer using lead in either paint or gasoline, so hopefully over time this problem diminishes. But as a basic element, lead is neither created nor destroyed. It sticks around where we don't need or want it. Guess what? Even if we don't need or want it, it is unavoidable. We are going to get a small amount of lead regardless of how careful we are. You can be a little more careful than 100 milligrams of soil daily, but you won't completely eliminate it from your diet. Fortunately, our bodies have at least some capacity to process this lead. When thinking about gardening in urban areas, we need to recognize that there is a good bit of variability in the distribution of this legacy lead. When we're near to major roadways, we will have that lead that came from leaded gasoline. And when we're near a house, particularly in the drip line of the house, we will have lead that comes from flaking and chipping paint. What can we do about this? Well, the starting point is testing for lead. No, this is not a new way of picking up dog turds. It is a soil coring tool that can be used to sample soils. That soil sample can be sent to a lab for analysis. Or, if you're lucky, in Milwaukee and elsewhere, we're starting to see the use of X-ray fluorescence as a quick screening test. It's not a laboratory analysis, but it gives a good general indication of lead levels in soil. What do we find when we look at urban soils? This is from our Growing Healthy Soils for Healthy Communities project in Milwaukee, where we sampled some garden soils, drip line soils, and lawn soils. And as you can see, there is an extremely wide range of lead contamination in these soils, going from very safe to very hazardous amounts of lead in the soils. How do we interpret that? 0 to 400, at least by Wisconsin standards, can be used for gardening. Although in other states that safe for gardening level is 0 to 200, 400 to 1200 parts per million, at least at the lower end of that range, you can safely garden with some precautions. And at over 1200 parts per million of lead in the soil, don't touch it, don't disturb it, cover it with grass, grow perennials, put down safe mulch, something along those lines. If you find yourself in need of fresh soil, you can purchase it commercially by the bag. It will have very low lead contamination. If you're buying truckloads, that typically will be coming from farmed soils. So you may want to have that provider do some analysis or do some analysis of your own before you use it as a replacement soil or as a soil in a raised bed garden. If I'm gardening in that middle range, say soils that are 400 parts per million, what can I expect in the produce? We did some comparison of store-bought versus backyard garden produce. As you can see, the backyard garden produce in relatively higher lead soils had somewhat higher lead content. This is not a major worry at these levels, still within at least US standards for safe amounts in foodstuffs. The most important thing to keep in mind is that those vegetables need to be very clean before we consume them. It is the residual soil that is going to be a problem.
Purchase your tracks today.
What can we do then to be growing safely in urban soils? Well, we can reduce the lead hazard by, as just mentioned, limiting contact with lead-contaminated soils. The first three of these are pretty obvious ones. Wash your hands, use doormats. Kids in particular, explore the world hand to mouth. Grandma, when you're out in the garden with grandchild, make sure that he or she is not putting their hands in their mouth. Scrub those vegetables. Use a doormat so you're not tracking garden soil into the house.
Purchase your tracks today.
Lots of other things that can be done. Don't garden in the drip line. Cover the bare soil. Convert contaminated soils to perennial beds. And replace the soil or build raised beds that allow you to put in clean soil. There is one other way that we can reduce lead hazard in urban soils. It starts with the notion that not all lead in the environment is as bioavailable. That is, it can be in forms that are not easily absorbed by the body. We know, for example, that when we raise the pH in the soil environment and add phosphorus, it forms lead phosphates that are less bioavailable than some of the other forms of lead in the environment. So we can do that by raising the pH and adding phosphorus in the soil. Things like bone meal, blood meal, or starter fertilizer can help to reduce the biohazard of the remaining amount of lead that is in our soil. So with that, I will conclude our virtual tour. I hope that you're able to safely practice urban gardening and enjoy seeing what others have done.